Elizabeth Warren sat quietly in the defendant's chair as Police Captain Richard Hayes adjusted his tie and prepared to destroy the career of one of America's most powerful senators. Completely unaware that the woman he was about to humiliate in front of a packed Boston courtroom had been methodically documenting his criminal activities for the past 2 years. The gavel echoed through the federal courthouse as Judge Margaret Sullivan called the session to order, but the real drama was about to unfold as Captain Hayes, with 26 years of decorated service, stood ready to expose what he believed was a massive campaign finance fraud scheme orchestrated by the senator from Massachusetts. Never imagining that Warren had been using her position and resources to investigate a corruption network that connected his police department directly to some of Wall Street's most powerful financial institutions. "Your Honor," Captain Hayes began, his voice filled with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "We're here today because Senator Elizabeth Warren has been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as a political campaign. She's been laundering money through fake donors, accepting illegal corporate contributions, and using her Senate position to cover up financial crimes that would land any ordinary citizen in federal prison." The courtroom buzzed with excitement as reporters leaned forward, cameras focused on Warren's calm expression. What they didn't know was that every word Hayes spoke was being recorded by federal investigators who had been monitoring his activities as part of Warren's comprehensive investigation into police corruption and corporate crime. The charges against Warren were serious enough to end her political career permanently. According to the federal indictment, she had accepted $3.2 million in illegal campaign contributions from shell companies connected to major Wall Street firms, falsified financial disclosure forms, and used her position on the Senate Banking Committee to provide insider information to wealthy donors. The evidence appeared overwhelming: financial records showing suspicious transfers, emails discussing special arrangements with corporate executives, and witness testimony from former campaign staffers who claimed Warren had personally directed the money laundering operation. But the real story had begun 26 months earlier, when Warren received an encrypted message through her Senate office's secure communication system. The message came from Jennifer Chen, a forensic accountant who had been investigating irregularities in Boston's civil asset forfeiture program. "Senator Warren," the message read, "I've discovered something that I believe connects local police corruption to major financial institutions. The patterns I'm seeing suggest that certain officers are being paid to target specific individuals whose assets are then transferred to offshore accounts controlled by Wall Street firms. I know this sounds impossible, but I have documentation that proves systematic coordination between law enforcement and corporate interests." Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't believe what happens next, and we've got more shocking celebrity stories coming your way every single day. For most politicians, such a message would have been forwarded to the appropriate authorities and forgotten. But Warren had built her entire career on fighting financial corruption, and Chen's allegations struck at the heart of everything she'd been working to expose. According to Federal Election Commission records, Warren had received more death threats than any other senator in 2023, with 78% of those threats coming from individuals with financial industry connections. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about a systematic effort to silence the most effective critic of Wall Street's influence on American politics. Warren's investigation began with her hiring Global Financial Investigations, a private firm specializing in complex financial crimes. The firm's director, former Treasury Department investigator Michael Rodriguez, had spent 15 years tracking money laundering operations and understood exactly how sophisticated financial criminals operated. Senator Warren, Rodriguez explained during their first meeting, what Ms. Chen is describing follows a pattern we've seen in other major cities. Corrupt officers target individuals with significant assets, use civil forfeiture to seize those assets, and then transfer the proceeds through a network of shell companies to offshore accounts. It's essentially legalized theft, but it requires coordination between law enforcement and financial institutions. What Rodriguez discovered in his preliminary investigation was far more sophisticated than typical police corruption. Captain Hayes wasn't just a corrupt cop taking bribes. He was operating as part of a network that connected the Boston Police Department directly to investment firms, hedge funds, and private equity companies. According to analysis by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, civil asset forfeiture cases in Hayes's jurisdiction had increased by 340% over the past 3 years, with 89% of seized assets never returned to their original owners despite only 23% of cases resulting in criminal convictions. The psychological profile that emerged of Captain Hayes was complex and troubling. According to studies by the American Psychological Association, officers who engage in systematic corruption often justify their actions through what researchers call noble cause corruption, the belief that illegal means are justified by supposedly good ends. Hayes had apparently convinced himself that his actions were necessary to fund police operations that politicians like Warren were trying to defund through budget cuts. But the financial analysis revealed something far more sinister. Hayes wasn't just stealing money to fund police operations. He was systematically targeting individuals and businesses that had supported Warren's political campaigns or her financial reform initiatives. Over the past 2 years, his unit had conducted asset forfeiture operations against 17 small business owners who had donated to Warren's campaigns, 12 community organizers who had supported her banking reform legislation, and 6 whistleblowers who had provided information about corporate misconduct to her Senate committee. The breakthrough in Warren's investigation came when Rodriguez's team identified Detective Lisa Martinez, a 10-year veteran who had been assigned to Hayes's asset forfeiture unit and was clearly struggling with the ethical implications of what she was witnessing. Martinez fit the profile of what law enforcement psychologists call a moral injury victim, an officer whose fundamental beliefs about justice and law enforcement had been shattered by exposure to systematic corruption. According to research by the Police Executive Research Forum, officers experiencing moral injury are 65% more likely to become whistleblowers if they're approached correctly and provided with adequate legal protections. Warren's team spent 4 months carefully cultivating Martinez, using techniques developed by federal investigators for recruiting informants within corrupt organizations. Rather than confronting her directly, they arranged for her to receive information about the Massachusetts Whistleblower Protection Act and the federal protections available to law enforcement officers who report corruption. It took 6 months of careful approach, but Martinez finally agreed to provide inside information about Hayes's operation. What she revealed was a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple asset forfeiture abuse. Hayes had been coordinating with corporate lawyers to identify businesses and individuals who posed threats to major financial institutions, then using his police powers to neutralize those threats through selective enforcement, asset seizure, and in some cases completely fabricated criminal charges. The evidence Martinez provided was devastating. Audio recordings of Hayes discussing specific targets with corporate representatives, financial records showing payments from shell companies to Hayes's personal accounts, and documentation of a systematic campaign to silence critics of Wall Street influence in Boston politics. But Warren wanted more than just Hayes. She wanted to expose the entire network of corporate interests that had corrupted local law enforcement. Working with Martinez as an inside source, Warren's investigation team began documenting the full scope of the corruption network. They discovered that Hayes's operation was connected to at least 6 major financial institutions, 12 law firms specializing in corporate defense, and a network of private investigators who had been conducting illegal surveillance on Warren's supporters and staff members. According to analysis by the Center for Investigative Reporting, corporate spending on local law enforcement partnerships had increased by 280% nationwide over the past 5 years, with much of that spending going to specialized units like Hayes's asset forfeiture team. What Warren's investigation revealed was that this wasn't just corporate influence. It was direct control over law enforcement operations designed to protect financial institutions from political and legal accountability. But Hayes wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically destroying the lives of people who had supported Warren's political agenda. Small business owners who had donated to her campaigns found themselves facing sudden tax audits, regulatory investigations, and asset forfeiture actions. Community organizers who had worked on her banking reform initiatives discovered that their personal financial records had been illegally accessed and distributed to corporate lawyers. The psychological impact on victims was severe. According to studies by the American Civil Liberties Union, individuals who experience police corruption suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder at rates comparable to combat veterans. Warren's investigation documented 17 cases of victims who had experienced severe mental health consequences as a result of Hayes's targeting, including 3 suicide attempts and 5 cases of individuals who had lost their homes and businesses. As Warren's investigation deepened, she discovered that Hayes's corruption network extended into the federal government itself. Several FBI agents assigned to financial crimes investigations in Boston had been receiving payments from the same shell companies that were funding Hayes's operations. This explained why previous complaints about police corruption had been ignored or buried by federal authorities. The scope of the conspiracy was unprecedented in modern American law enforcement. According to federal prosecutors who would later review Warren's evidence, the network represented the most sophisticated integration of corporate interests and police power in U.S. history. It wasn't just corruption. It was a systematic effort to use law enforcement as a private security force for financial institutions. Warren's investigation also revealed the personal toll that fighting this corruption had taken on her and her family. Death threats had increased by 400% since she'd begun her banking reform work, with many of those threats coming from individuals with documented connections to the financial institutions that Hayes was protecting. Her Senate office had been burglarized 3 times, her personal financial records had been illegally accessed, and her family members had been subjected to harassment and surveillance. But Warren's commitment to exposing the truth never wavered. She had spent her entire career fighting for ordinary Americans against powerful financial interests, and discovering that those interests had corrupted law enforcement only strengthened her resolve. She was willing to risk her political career, her personal safety, and her family's security to ensure that this corruption was exposed and stopped. The trap was set when Hayes decided to target Warren directly. He had become aware of her investigation through informants within the federal government and had convinced himself that he could destroy her credibility by fabricating evidence of campaign finance violations. Working with corrupt federal agents and corporate lawyers, Hayes built what appeared to be an airtight case against Warren for accepting illegal campaign contributions. What Hayes didn't realize was that Warren's investigation team had been monitoring his communications and financial activities for months. They knew about his plan to frame her before he implemented it. They had documented evidence of his meetings with corporate representatives, his coordination with corrupt federal agents, and his systematic efforts to fabricate evidence against her. The fabricated evidence against Warren was sophisticated and convincing. Financial records showing suspicious transfers, emails discussing illegal contributions, and witness testimony from paid informants all painted a picture of systematic campaign finance fraud. Hayes had spent months building the case, convinced that destroying Warren would end the investigation into his activities and protect his corporate sponsors. But Warren's legal team was prepared. They had spent 2 years documenting every aspect of Hayes's corruption network, building a comprehensive case that would expose not just his individual crimes, but the entire system of corporate influence over law enforcement. The evidence Warren had collected was so extensive that federal prosecutors would later describe it as the most complete documentation of police corruption in modern American history. On the morning of the trial, Hayes stood before Judge Sullivan convinced that he was about to destroy the career of one of America's most powerful senators. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and corporate lawyers who believed they were about to witness Warren's political downfall. What they didn't know was that sitting in the gallery were FBI agents with sealed indictments for Hayes and 17 other individuals connected to the corruption network. "Your Honor," Hayes continued, his voice growing more confident, "Senator Warren has spent years claiming to fight for ordinary Americans while secretly enriching herself through illegal campaign contributions and corporate corruption. She's everything that's wrong with American politics. A hypocrite who uses her position to benefit herself while attacking the very institutions that make our economy strong." Warren's attorney, David Chen, one of the most respected white-collar defense lawyers in Boston, stood slowly. He looked at Hayes with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed satisfaction. "Your Honor," before Captain Hayes continues with his presentation, "the defense would like to introduce some evidence that we believe will be highly relevant to these proceedings." Chen activated a large screen that had been installed in the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is the result of a 2-year investigation conducted by Senator Warren into systematic corruption within the Boston Police Department and its connections to major financial institutions. Captain Hayes, I believe you'll find this particularly illuminating." The room fell silent as the first piece of evidence appeared on the screen. A financial analysis showing $12 million in assets seized by Hayes's unit, with only $2.3 million ever returned to victims. Then came the audio recordings of Hayes discussing specific targets with corporate representatives, followed by documentation of payments from shell companies to his personal accounts. Captain Hayes's face went pale as he realized that his attempt to destroy Elizabeth Warren had just exposed 2 years of criminal activity to a courtroom full of federal agents and reporters. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, audio recordings, witness testimony, and documentation of a systematic effort to use police powers to protect corporate interests from political accountability. As federal agents moved forward with handcuffs, Warren finally spoke. "Captain Hayes, for 2 years I've watched you use your badge to protect the very financial institutions that have been destroying American families. You thought you could intimidate me, but you've only proven why we need to continue fighting for real accountability in our justice system." The aftermath was swift and devastating for the corruption network. Within a week, federal agents had arrested Hayes and 17 other individuals connected to the conspiracy, including 3 FBI agents, 7 corporate lawyers, and 4 executives from major financial institutions. The evidence Warren had collected led to the seizure of $47 million in assets and the identification of over 200 victims who had been targeted by the corruption network. 6 months later, Warren stood before the Senate Banking Committee as they passed the Financial Accountability and Police Reform Act, new legislation requiring independent oversight of all asset forfeiture operations and criminal penalties for corporate attempts to influence law enforcement. "Sometimes," she told her colleagues, "the fight for justice requires us to risk everything. But that's exactly what we were elected to do." The investigation ultimately resulted in the conviction of Hayes and 12 other defendants, the return of $9.7 million in seized assets to victims, and fundamental reforms to how law enforcement agencies interact with corporate interests. Most importantly, it proved that even the most sophisticated corruption networks couldn't withstand the determination of someone willing to fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. Elizabeth Warren's courage in exposing this corruption network not only saved her own career but protected the democratic process itself from corporate manipulation. Her investigation showed that the fight for economic justice wasn't just about policy. It was about ensuring that law enforcement serves the people, not the highest bidder.